You mentioned there the problems, and so of course contradictions are one of the main issues with it. The other problems, I suppose, associated with the SDGs might be the gaps that are in it. So would you have any thoughts on maybe the gaps that are in it and maybe how to address them?
Yes, well, there are many different gaps. I think one key gap that people, again, the critics or scholars looking at the SDGs would have said is it doesn't really strongly take a position on demilitarization. That would be one. So we still have wars and we still have armies. So this would be one of the integrity measures as to how serious governments are. There's nothing more utterly wasteful of resources and useless expenditure than militaries. Why have we that? Why have we militaries? So we have militaries because they're symptomatic of a world that is divided and with conflict and so on, and geopolitical tensions and so forth. And in a world where all governments were truly committed to the SDGs, which include a commitment to peace, then militaries would have to be scaled down. So this is a good measure of something missing in the SDGs and a measure of how difficult creating the future will be. Because let's imagine we said we wanted to do degrowth, and we wanted also to stop reducing, to start reducing resources, and we wanted to improve resource distribution and quality of life. Well, one flipping way to do it is to stand down or begin to reduce the vast military reserves all around the world that very poor countries also have. Now, that would be a cheap way to do degrowth because you'll just be shutting down your military, which is probably using up multiple percentages of many countries' GDP. And you would be freeing up all of the technical and scientific resources tied up in the military and all the guys who probably are inventing drones and weapon systems and radar and learning how to build new jet aircraft and tanks and so on and so forth. That you take all of that activity, all of those resources out of the military framework and deploy it to dealing with these issues that we're talking about, which we need to do. So that's one of the very big gaps in the SDGs. This failure to address the question of the militarization of the planet and the need to take out and to really radically reduce military. So we have become a bit blasé. We're less so just now around other things that people would have been very concerned about, let's say in the 1960s, which is nuclear war. And that had quite a number of countries maintain nuclear arsenals. We have 3 superpowers at least with very, very large nuclear arsenals, enough to end all life, all meaningful life, at least for us, higher life on the planet. That's just not acceptable, and the cost and the waste and the resource misapplication involved in maintaining those systems and so on, the satellite systems and all the rest of it that supports them. I mean, that's just a horrendous problem in a world of climate change and poverty and so on and so forth. So there needs to be an SDG to do a denuclearization. Full stop. We need a complete nuclear disarmament if we are to be serious, so that we don't have that threat hanging over us. We're back under that threat again now. We've forgotten all about it since the days of Cuba, and every now and again it would raise its head over the years, but never seriously. But now it's very much serious again for us. And we've also problems with China and the United States that equally could escalate very quickly. We have nuclear weapons in both Pakistan and India, and they're always loggerheads with always the potential there for problems. Israel is certainly a nuclear armed state, and it's surrounded also by hostile forces. So there's multiple places where the use of nuclear weapons is at least conceivable, and it would have a devastating impact globally. So that's a big problem because all bets are off then. At that point, we have a different set of problems if we have nuclear exchanges going on. So that's a key deficit. SDGs needed to be much firmer on to do with disarmament, and particularly nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament specifically.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Are there any other gaps that strike you, or
No, I mean, I think
that is a very clear one.
That's a big one. Yeah, I think no, because you can always find little points of detail. I think there's a point of being fair. Then the SDGs can't have everything, because everyone will have some issue, and there's loads of things. But I think the broad headings of the SDGs are fairly comprehensive in fairness. So we always have an evolution of new problems and new issues. Like in gender, new issues have come up. But we have a commitment there to gender equality and so on. So we can't quite attack the SDGs for everything. They can't do everything, but the military stuff is really critical one, and also it betrays that these are put together by governments, and governments just don't want to go there. Most governments like having militaries and like having weapons and all that kind of stuff. So that's just the world we live in. I suppose the other thing you could say is, I mean, again, I'm not sure how fair it is, but it's back to this conceptual framework that is very much a Western way of thinking. So we have to be careful about being ethnocentric in the way we're thinking. So we think as Westerners, and for us, you have targets and then you set programs and so on. Just imagine a conceptual switch where we begin to think about sustainability in terms of generations yet to be born. And then we begin to think that the issue here is not so much us and our quality of life, but the quality of life of our grandchildren, and that they should be included in the democratic community. So a lot of the history of democracy has been the extension of the franchise to include ever and ever wider groups of human beings. Like initially in the United States, only white men over the age of 35 who owned a certain amount of property could vote, and that was regarded then as radical democracy. And that franchise, and it was radical for the 1770s, and that franchise gradually gets extended. I mean, it's not until 1918 that women vote for the first time in Ireland and in the wider UK at the time. 1918, that's just about a century ago. There were elections, democratic votes in the UK right into the middle of the 19th century, but no women. And there were also property limits and so on. So you only get a universal franchise very recently, 1918. And then even then it was women, they were older than men and so on. So there was all kinds of biases built into it. So so democracy is often about extending the franchise. And so what about if we looked at new types of eco-democracy? So for example, non-human life forms, could they have a vote? Could we model a way to represent the interests of other than human beings on the planet? Could habitats get to vote? Or other species vote in elections? Now, you'd have to think how to do that, and there are ways to do it within political science. You'd have to get democratic legitimacy around it, but it would allow that votes, it would broaden this anthropocentric limit that we have and say other living beings ought to be able to input into the decisions we make. They're not concerned about economic growth. They're concerned about habitat protection. So that's an interest, for example, that trees might have. Now, can we model that into the way we do legislation and policy? See, in the Western mind, you see now how we're hitting the limits of Western liberalism here, because Western liberals think as individuals and as human individuals. So to suddenly think, hold on a second, you're allowing animals to vote. I mean, this just is nonsense. So you see, this is conceptually, it goes beyond what we're familiar with. Or the future. What about if we decided that the next 3-4 generations also get to vote? Now, they can't literally vote, obviously, but their interests can be represented within a representative democracy, so that they have blocks of people in parliaments who represent non-human life interests or not yet born human interests, and who say, look, from the perspective of the future, this policy regarding transport or this policy regarding energy is not going to work for us because we can say it's going to have this negative impact. Now, here is where we hit this exact point that we talked about to do with education. If you educate people within Western humanism, then what I've just outlined there is literally nonsense. It's actually laughable, and you think that's just stupid. That's true within the constraints of Western humanism, because that's all about the individual human actor and who else would decide things except me now today. But if you think outside of our cultural framework and start looking at other cultural frameworks, including those submerged ones even within the Western tradition, this extension of autonomy or extension of agency beyond the individual human is entirely possible. The limit is not a practical one. It's a cultural one. It's a conceptual one. It's just we can't think like that. We just can't think. What the hell would it mean that trees would have a vote in the Dáil? Like, that just is conceptually challenging for us, but it's actually not practically challenging. You can practically do it. So that's a measure of the switch that we need if we are really to implement the SDGs. It's not just here's this policy and then we do that policy and we measure and we get this. It's this much bigger conceptual paradigm shift into an altered understanding of reality, which in turn alters our institutions, including institutions of democracy, to do democracy in a very different way. So we would then get different outcomes. We'll get different results based on this widening of the democratic franchise and this widening of democratic interests. And this is where third level colleges are critical. Because if we keep educating people within the liberal paradigm, which we do now, we are not equipping people for that conceptual switch. But if we don't start teaching people for a 21st century world, then we're never going to have that 21st century world. So we have a duty, in a sense, to begin to look at these wider things that I'm talking about. I'm just illustrating them with those two very simple examples to do with democracy. I mean, the same thing could apply to every business. Who are the stakeholders for businesses? They just think about their customers. What if you widen that out and make it legally mandated that they had to consider habitats other than human life forms, future generations yet unborn, and that these were actually given corporate shareholding, that they had actual interests in the company and that the company was accountable. I mean, these are conceptual things way beyond our legal framework and beyond our political framework, but this is the territory we have to move into if we are to save our problem. We won't save the issues we have now based on the thinking that has brought us to these problems. It will require a new type of thinking so that we outflank our problems and see them from a different perspective. And that's where the SDGs are limited, because they're conceptually still bound within the current world as we understand it. They point, in fairness, to a future, but they don't articulate a truly conceptually different future. That's a task for us to do, I think, especially in third level colleges. We have a big job there.
Yeah, that's that's a well made point there. I mean, I think in terms of direction, I often think if I think as the SDGs, as in pointing in a direction, it's like if you want to go north from any position around the globe, this, you can take 17 points. They're all pointing in the same direction, even though they're starting from different points, but they're all heading. And that's the kind of way I conceptualize that we're heading in a particular direction.